Out in that part of West Texas, nobody talked about water out loud, not because it was forbidden, but because everyone already understood what it meant. In 1913, land didn't define a man. Access to water did. And there were places where a well was worth more than any fence, any deed, or any handshake agreement a man could make. That spring came in dry, too dry. The cattle started going down before the sun even reached its peak. First one, then three, then more than a man cared to count. Swollen tongues, dull eyes, bodies too heavy to move and too many to bury. Still no one asked questions, because there was an understanding in that country. A man handled his own business and looked the other way when it came to someone else's. That's when the name Elias Turner started showing up in quiet conversations. Never spoken too loud, never said all the way through, like finishing the thought might bring trouble with it. He was known for doing things the right way, always had been, until the day someone found horse tracks near his well that didn't belong to him, and out there, that was never a small thing. Before we go any further, let me ask you something. Where are you watching this from? I'm always curious to see how far these stories travel. Sometimes across states, sometimes across entire countries, and every now and then they find someone who understands exactly what's being said here. If you feel like it, leave a comment with your city or state. And if you appreciate stories told this way, slower, more grounded, without all the noise, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. That's what helps keep stories like this alive. Now, let's go back to that dry stretch of Texas in 1913. In 1913, that part of West Texas still lived, as if the rest of the world was too far away to matter. The First World War hadn't officially begun yet, but it already existed as a distant rumor, something that came in old newspapers days late, when they arrived at all. Out there, what truly carried weight wasn't politics or conflict overseas. It was the land. The economy was simple, almost raw. Cattle, a few resilient crops, and agreements made more by word than by paper. Government presence was rare, and when it showed up, it usually came too late. Order wasn't kept by written law. It was held together by understood limits and consequences no one needed explained twice. The men in that region were shaped by that kind of life. Some came from families that had endured generations of drought, loss, and isolation. Others had seen smaller conflicts. Land disputes, quiet fights that never made it into any official record. There was no room for visible weakness, and no habit of speaking openly about hardship. Each man carried what he had to carry and kept moving forward. It was a kind of silence learned early, not by choice, but because saying too much usually made things worse. Elias Turner grew up inside that world and never knew a different one. The son of a man who rarely repeated instructions, he learned by watching, making a mistake once, maybe twice, and understanding quickly enough not to need correction again. When he inherited the small stretch of land he worked, there was no ceremony, no celebration. It was just another day that continued, as if nothing had changed. He wasn't known for ambition, and he wasn't known for warmth. He was known for consistency, and in that place, that was enough to earn a man respect. His routine followed the rhythm of the land itself. He woke before daylight, checked the cattle, walked the fences, and always ended in the same place, the well. Water in that region wasn't just a basic need. It was the axis everything turned around. Without it, there was no herd. Without a herd, there was no living. And without a living, a man's name disappeared faster than anyone cared to remember. Elias's well had never run completely dry, and that alone placed him in a quiet position of importance. Not power spoken out loud, but responsibility understood without words. But that spring of 1913, the land began to shift in ways men like Elias learned to recognize without needing to talk about it. The wind came in drier, the soil hardened earlier than it should have, and the cattle started moving differently, more restless, more scattered, like they were reacting to something not yet visible. Elias noticed it all without saying a word, the way he always did. But one morning, standing by the well longer than usual, something unfamiliar settled in. For the first time in years, it wasn't the work on his mind. It was the quiet sense that this time, doing things the right way might not be enough. Elias Turner wasn't the kind of man who drew attention when he walked into a place, and maybe that was exactly why people remembered him after he left. In the small town, a few miles down the dirt road, folks recognized him easily, but rarely pulled him into long conversations. He'd nod, take care of what needed doing, and head back the same way he came. There was no rush in him, but there was no room for distraction either. Anyone paying close enough attention could tell Elias didn't avoid people. He just avoided everything that came with them. The reputation he carried hadn't been built all at once, and not through anything grand. It came together over time, in small decisions no one announced, but everyone noticed. He never left a broken fence standing longer than a day, never sold weak cattle as if they were strong, never took more than his share in a simple agreement, and more than anything, he never asked for help before exhausting every way to handle things himself. It wasn't pride. Not exactly. It was a way of keeping things in their proper place, without creating a debt that didn't need to exist. There was a story that made its way around now and then, though never told in front of him. Years earlier, during a lighter, dry spell, a neighboring rancher had nearly lost part of his herd for lack of water. Elias didn't offer words, didn't make a show of it. He just opened access to his well for a few days, long enough to keep things from getting worse. He never charged for it, never brought it up again, and whenever someone tried to mention it, he'd shift the subject like it didn't belong in the conversation. To him, some things weren't favors. They were simply what had to be done, but there were clear limits to the code he lived by. Helping didn't mean allowing himself to be taken advantage of. Sharing didn't mean giving up control, and trust, once broken, didn't find its way back easily. Elias believed, or maybe just accepted, that a man only held value as long as his actions stayed within a certain pattern. Once that pattern broke, it wasn't just the relationship between two men that changed. It was the place that man held in the whole region. And out there, that kind of loss didn't mend quickly. That same spring, as the land itself began to shift, Elias kept moving through his days with the same precision as always. But small things started slipping just outside that pattern, almost too subtle to call out at first. A fence that looked right, but wasn't exactly the way he left it. Tracks where there shouldn't have been any. Details too small to accuse, but too clear for a man like him to ignore. And it was there, in that narrow space between what could be explained and what couldn't, that Elias's code began to be tested, not by words, but by something far harder to face: doubt. At first it didn't seem like anything worth real attention. In a place like that, small irregularities were part of the land. A fence pushed slightly out of place by the wind, a stray animal drifting farther than it should, old tracks mistaken for new ones. Any man used to that kind of life learned not to react too quickly. Elias knew that, always had, and that was exactly why, the first time he noticed something different near the well, he did nothing but take note of it. The horse tracks were there, faint, nearly erased by the dry wind from the night before. They weren't deep enough to suggest urgency, and not fresh enough to say exactly when they'd been made. But they weren't random either. Elias knew his own patterns, the routes he took every day, and those tracks didn't follow them. Still, he said nothing, didn't go into town, didn't ask around, didn't change his routine in any obvious way. He simply held on to the detail, the same way he did with anything that didn't yet have a clear answer. Over the next few days, other small signs began to show, always in the same way, quiet, almost invisible, but steady enough to form something that couldn't be dismissed anymore. The water level in the well seemed to drop a little faster than usual, not enough to raise alarm on its own, but enough for a man like Elias to notice. He knew that well, the way a man knows his own breathing, how it held, how it recovered, how much it could give, and something about it had slipped out of rhythm. Even then, he didn't act, because acting, in that place, meant more than solving a problem. It meant admitting there was one, and that alone had weight. To accuse without certainty was to invite conflict, and conflict, out there, rarely settled itself with words. Elias wasn't afraid of it, but he wasn't the kind of man who stepped into something without knowing where it might lead. So he did what he had always done best. He kept watching, in silence, waiting for the situation to reveal itself. But this time, silence didn't bring clarity. One morning, drier than the rest, with the wind already warm before the sun had fully risen, Elias found something that left no room for doubt. The tracks were deeper now, fresher, and they led straight to the well. There was no effort to hide them, no care taken to cover the trail. This wasn't carelessness, it was a decision, and standing there, without saying a word, Elias understood that something had crossed a line that until then no one in that land had dared to step over. After that day, Elias no longer had to look for signs. They started showing up on their own, always in the same place, always with the same quiet precision. Horse tracks appeared overnight and faded through the day under the dry wind, but never enough to disappear completely. The water level kept dropping faster than it should, and the cattle began to show it more clearly. Less strength, less movement, standing longer under the sun as if conserving what little they had left. Still nothing was spoken out loud, because out there, admitting a problem was nearly the same as admitting weakness. Elias kept his routine, at least on the surface. He woke at the same hour, followed the same paths, handled each task the way he always had. But something had shifted underneath that consistency. Now, he watched with purpose. Every step around the well was measured, every mark in the dirt studied as if it carried more than just movement. He didn't need anyone else to confirm it. He already knew. Someone was taking water from his well, and it wasn't a one-time thing. It was repeated, steady, deliberate. In town, nothing seemed different. The few men who gathered there still talked about the weather, cattle prices, and small daily struggles. No one spoke directly about water, and no one looked at Elias like they knew something. But there was something else, something quieter, harder to name. The silence felt heavier, as if some already suspected, but chose not to get involved. Because if there was one thing every man understood out there, it was that certain situations didn't get better when more eyes were placed on them. Days passed, and with them came the confirmation Elias had expected, but not wanted. The well was no longer recovering at the same pace. The water was still there, but now it demanded more time, more restraint, more care. What had started as an intrusion was turning into something else. A real threat, not just to him, but to everything tied to that water, the herd, the land, the living itself. And still, he didn't confront it directly, because once a thing like that was brought into the open, it didn't go back to what it had been. That was when something shifted in him. Not sudden, not loud, but firm enough to change what came next. For the first time since noticing the problem, Elias stopped simply observing. One night, without saying a word to anyone, he adjusted his routine. He didn't go to the well the next day the way he usually did. He waited, and when darkness settled back over the dry land, Elias Turner was awake, not to work, but to see for himself who had chosen to cross a line that had stood untouched for years. Night settled slowly, the way it always did out there, but Elias didn't follow his usual rhythm. He stayed awake, still for most of it, waiting without restlessness, but with a quiet certainty that something would come. The wind had died down, making every sound carry farther than usual, and that's how he heard it. Faint at first, then clearer, the steady controlled steps of a horse approaching. There was no doubt. This wasn't chance. It was someone who had done this before. Elias didn't move right away. He let the man reach the well, let him dismount, let him begin the work as if he were alone in the world. Only then did Elias step out from the dark, without hurry, without raising his voice. The other man froze for a moment, not out of pure surprise, but like someone who knew this moment had been coming for some time. There was no greeting, no immediate explanation, just the soft sound of water being drawn, cut short by a silence too heavy to ignore. When words finally came, they weren't spoken in anger. They were worse than that. The man, a rancher from farther out, someone Elias had known by sight for years, didn't deny what he was doing. He didn't apologize either. He said only what needed to be said in a few steady sentences. His own well had started failing weeks earlier. The cattle were already weakening. He had tried to fix it on his own, tried digging deeper, tried finding another spot. Nothing held, so he started coming at night, taking just enough to keep what was left alive. Elias listened without interrupting, because he understood. He understood the desperation, understood the choice, and understood why it had been done in silence. But understanding didn't make it easier. It made it harder, because now this wasn't an unknown trespass. It was a man who had crossed a line, knowing exactly what it meant. And out there, that changed everything. It shifted the weight from suspicion to decision. There was no comfortable way out. If Elias stopped him, the other man would lose what little he had left. If he allowed it, he would be risking his own future. Not all at once, but in a way that would come due eventually. The hardest part wasn't choosing between right and wrong. It was choosing which consequence he was willing to carry afterward. They stood there for a moment longer than it should have taken, neither man rushing what couldn't be rushed. And then, without raising his voice, without making a threat, Elias made his decision, not as a rancher, but as a man who understood exactly what it would cost. Out in that part of Texas, no one ever asked what Elias Turner decided that night, and he never told. His cattle made it through the dry season, but not with the same strength as before. The other man stayed on his land for a while longer, until one day he simply wasn't there anymore. There was no argument, no record, No public explanation, just the kind of silence that place understood well, because in the end, some decisions don't just change what happens next. They change the weight a man carries, even when no one is there to see it.